The rain had never stopped. 10 years ago, it began, a relentless, steady downpour that turned the city into a drenched labyrinth of shimmering lights and slick asphalt. No one could explain it. Meteorologists blamed an unprecedented atmospheric anomaly. Conspiracy theorists whispered about government experiments gone wrong. But as the years dragged on, the rain became less a curiosity and more a fact of life. Umbrella cellars thrived, flood basements became the norm, and the city's name began to fade into irrelevance. For Clara Mason, the rain was just another part of the city's pulse. It was as familiar as the sound of traffic horns, the glow of flickering neon signs, and the muffled hum of conversations in the bars and diners she frequented. But tonight, as she trudged down an alley toward the lantern, the rain felt different. It clung to her, heavy and cold, soaking through her coat no matter how tightly she pulled it around herself. The usual rhythm of the downpour had shifted, almost like it was trying to form a pattern, a message just out of reach. She shook the thought away. She was tired, overworked, and probably imagining things. Her boots splashed through a deep puddle as she approached the bar, its crooked neon sign buzzing faintly in the gloom. The lantern was a relic of another time, a dive tucked into a forgotten corner of the city, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of spilled whiskey. It was where Clara did her best work, meeting sources who thrived in the shadows. She pushed the door open, the warm light inside spilling over her like a blanket. Reggie, the bartender, glanced up from polishing a glass and gave her a familiar grunt of acknowledgement. "Late night, Mason?" he said, setting the glass down. Clara nodded, shaking the rain from her hair. "You know me, Reggie. Always chasing the next story." Reggie smirked. "Well, you're not gonna find much here tonight. Crowd's thinner than usual." Clara scanned the room. A handful of patrons sat scattered at tables and along the bar, their faces obscured by shadows and the haze of smoke. In the corner, a man hunched over a newspaper, his hands trembling slightly. Near the back, a woman in a rain-soaked trench coat nursed a drink, her eyes darting nervously toward the door every few seconds. And then there was him. A figure sat at the farthest table, shrouded in shadow. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face, and his hands rested motionless on the table. Unlike the others, he wasn't drinking or smoking. He wasn't even pretending to blend in. He just sat there, staring at the rain-slicked window like he was waiting for something, or someone. Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she forced herself to look away. She wasn't here to get distracted. She was here for Mick. "Seen Mick around?" she asked Reggie as she slid onto a bar stool. Reggie's face darkened. "Not for a couple days. He was here Wednesday night, said he had something big to tell you. Something about the rain." Clara leaned forward. "Did he say what?" "Nope," Reggie said, shaking his head. "Just that he'd meet you here tonight. But I haven't seen him since." Clara frowned. Mick was one of her best sources, a streetwise informant who always seemed to know when something bad was brewing in the city. If he'd gone silent, it wasn't a good sign. Reggie set a glass of whiskey in front of her. "Careful, Mason. This city's got a way of swallowing people whole." She took a sip, the burn of the whiskey grounding her. "Thanks for the warning, Reggie. I'll let you know if I see him." She turned toward the door, intending to leave, but a low, unfamiliar sound stopped her. A whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the bar, but unmistakable. "Clara." She froze, her eyes scanning the room. No one was looking at her. The man in the corner hadn't moved. The whisper came again, softer this time, like it was coming from the rain itself. "Clara." Her heart thudded in her chest as she stood and made her way toward the door. The whisper faded as soon as she stepped outside, replaced by the steady drumming of the rain. The city felt heavier than usual, the buildings looming like silent sentinels over the glistening streets. Clara pulled her coat tighter and started walking, her boots splashing through puddles that seemed deeper than they should have been. The whisper came again. "Clara." This time, it was clearer. She spun around, her breath fogging in the cold night air. The alley behind her was empty, the shadows stretching long and dark beneath the flickering light of a street lamp. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Just the rain, falling harder now, and the faint hum of the city in the distance. She quickened her pace, her mind racing. She didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything else that couldn't be explained by logic and reason. But the whisper had felt real, too real to ignore. By the time she reached her apartment, she was drenched and shaking. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her breathing ragged. Her apartment was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of newspapers and the faint smell of coffee. She tossed her coat onto a chair and sank onto the couch, running a hand through her damp hair. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She grabbed it, her stomach tightening when she saw the message. "Stop asking questions. You won't like the answers." The number was unknown. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Before she could reply, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. And then, in the silence, she heard it again. "Clara." This time, the whisper was inside the apartment. The rain hadn't let up by morning. It pounded against the windows of Clara's apartment, muffling the sounds of the waking city. She sat at her cluttered desk, staring at the text from the night before. The words glared at her like an accusation. "Stop asking questions. You won't like the answers." Who had sent it? And what did they know about her investigation? Clara leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the rain itself had eyes. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. It was Detective Elliot Graves. "I need you to come down to Dockside," he said without preamble. His voice was tense, clipped. "It's Mick." Clara's heart sank. "What happened?" "Just get here." The line went dead. The Dockside district was a desolate sprawl of abandoned warehouses and rusting shipping containers. Clara arrived to find it crawling with cops. Blue and red lights flashed against the rain-slicked pavement, casting eerie shadows across the scene. Elliot Graves stood near the edge of the police tape, his coat soaked through and his face grim. He was tall, with sharp features and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. Clara had worked with him before on several stories. He wasn't the friendliest cop on the force, but he was one of the few who didn't dismiss her as a nosy journalist. "What's going on?" she asked as she approached. Elliot gave her a long look before motioning her closer. "I shouldn't even let you see this, but I know you had a connection to him." He led her toward a cluster of officers huddled around a tarp-covered figure. The smell hit her first, coppery, metallic, and cloying. Elliot pulled back the tarp, and Clara felt her stomach lurch. It was Mick, or what was left of him. His body was twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Deep lacerations covered his chest, and his hands were shredded, as if he tried to fight something off. But what struck Clara the most was his eyes, or rather, the lack of them. Empty sockets stared up at the sky, rain pooling where his eyes should have been. "Jesus," Clara whispered, covering her mouth. Elliot replaced the tarp. "We found him like this early this morning. A jogger spotted the body and called it in. No witnesses, no suspects." Clara swallowed hard. "Do you think this was normal?" "I mean, not normal, but..." "Not normal," Elliot finished for her. This wasn't some random mugging gone wrong. Whoever, or whatever, did this wanted to make a point. Clara's mind raced. Mick had been paranoid in their last conversation, hinting at something big. Could this have been connected to what he was trying to tell her? He mentioned the rain, Clara said, her voice low. Elliot raised an eyebrow. What about it? 2 nights ago, he called me. Said he had something to tell me, something about the rain. He never got the chance. Elliot frowned, his jaw tightening. Look, Mason, I know you like chasing weird stories, but you're not a cop. Let me handle this. Elliot, Mick was my source. He trusted me. If he died because of something he knew, I need to find out what it was. Elliot sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. Fine. But if you dig too deep, don't expect me to save you. Clara spent the rest of the day retracing Mick's steps. She visited his usual haunts, coffee shops, dive bars, the shady back alleys where he conducted most of his business. No one had seen him in the past 2 days, but a few people mentioned he'd been acting strange, jumpy, like he was scared of something. As the rain turned to a torrential downpour, Clara found herself drawn to the spot where Mick's body had been discovered. The crime scene tape was gone, but the area was deserted, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling the chains on a nearby gate. She crouched down, examining the ground where his body had lain. The rain had washed away most of the evidence, but she spotted something glinting faintly in the gutter. A small key. Clara picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. It was old and rusted, with no markings to indicate what it might open. But Mick must have dropped it, and she had a feeling it was important. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps splashing through the puddles behind her. She turned quickly, her heart pounding. A man stood at the edge of the alley, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. "Can I help you?" Clara called, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, watching her. Clara's grip tightened on the key. "If you've got something to say, say it. Otherwise, get lost." Still, the man said nothing. The rain seemed to grow louder, drowning out everything else. Clara took a step back, her pulse racing. When she blinked, the man was gone. That evening, Clara met Elliot at a diner near the precinct. The place was nearly empty, the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. "What do you make of this?" she asked, sliding the key across the table to him. Elliot picked it up, frowning. "Where'd you find it?" "Near where Mick was killed. I think it belonged to him." Elliot turned the key over in his hands. "Looks like it opens an old lockbox or a safe. But where?" "That's what I was hoping you could help me figure out," Clara said. Elliot sighed. "You really don't let things go, do you?" "Not when someone I know gets murdered," she shot back. Elliot leaned back in his chair, studying her. "All right. I'll run it through the system, see if we can match it to anything. But you need to be careful, Clara. Whoever did this to Mick, they won't hesitate to come after you." "I can handle myself," Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. Elliot didn't look convinced either. "Just don't do anything stupid." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, staring at the key and the scattered notes she'd made about Mick, the rain, and the mysterious man in the alley. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but she felt like she was on the verge of something big, something dangerous. The rain outside grew heavier, hammering against the windows like a warning. Clara's phone buzzed, and she grabbed it, half expecting another ominous message. Instead, it was a photo from Elliot. It showed a lockbox, old and battered, with a keyhole that matched the one she'd found. The message beneath it read, found in an abandoned warehouse near Dockside. Meet me there tomorrow. Clara's heart raced. The lockbox had to be connected to Mick. Whatever was inside could be the key to understanding what had happened to him, and what he'd discovered about the rain. As she stared at the photo, a faint sound reached her ears. A whisper. It was soft at first, almost drowned out by the rain, but it grew louder, more insistent. Clara. She turned toward the window, her breath catching. A figure stood on the fire escape outside, shrouded in shadow. It was the man in the hat. And he was smiling. By morning, the rain had settled into its usual rhythm, tapping against Clara's window like an unrelenting metronome. Sleep had eluded her again, leaving her with bloodshot eyes and a gnawing sense of unease. The image of the figure on her fire escape lingered in her mind, his eerie smile etched into her memory. Clara sat at her desk, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, poring over her notes. Her messy scrawl filled page after page, a tangle of half-formed theories and cryptic connections. At the center of it all was the rain. The rain never stops. The rain sees everything. It was something Mick had said to her weeks ago, during one of his drunken rambles. At the time, she brushed it off as paranoia. Now, she wasn't so sure. She opened her laptop and pulled up the city's public records. For years, Clara had relied on these databases to dig up leads. Missing persons, unsolved crimes, suspicious deaths. It was all there, buried under layers of bureaucracy and red tape. She began by searching for missing persons reports over the past decade, narrowing her focus to the years after the rain started. The list was staggering. Hundreds of names, faces, and stories, all tied to the city's relentless downpour. As she sifted through the data, a pattern began to emerge. The disappearances weren't random. They clustered around certain dates, nights when the rain had been particularly heavy, according to weather records. Clara leaned closer, her pulse quickening. The most recent cluster had occurred just days before Mick's death. She cross-referenced the reports with police records, looking for anything unusual. In several cases, witnesses had mentioned hearing strange noises before the victims disappeared, whispers in the rain, just like she had heard. Her stomach turned. What if Mick had been right? What if the rain wasn't just a backdrop to the city's misery, but an active participant? Later that day, Clara headed to the precinct to meet Elliot. The lockbox he'd found weighed heavily on her mind, and she was eager to see what secrets it held. The precinct was a hive of activity when she arrived, officers and detectives buzzing around like bees in a hive. Elliot was waiting for her in a conference room, the lockbox sitting on the table between them. "Looks like it hasn't been opened in decades," he said as she walked in. Clara took a seat, eyeing the box. It was small, made of tarnished metal, with ornate engravings that looked like they belonged in another era. "Any idea what's inside?" she asked. Elliot shook his head. "I was waiting for you. Thought you'd want to see this firsthand." He slid the key across the table. Clara hesitated for a moment before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. The key fit perfectly into the lock. With a soft click, the box opened, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and a small, leather-bound journal. Elliot picked up one of the papers, his brow furrowing as he read. "These are old police reports. Look, dates from the late 1980s, early 1990s. Clara flipped through the journal, her heart sinking with every page. It was filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and newspaper clippings, all detailing disappearances in the city. The entries grew more frantic as they progressed, the handwriting devolving into an illegible scrawl. One word appeared over and over again: rain. "What the hell is this?" Elliot muttered, holding up one of the sketches. It depicted a humanoid figure, tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and blank, featureless eyes. Clara's blood ran cold. It was the same figure she'd seen on her fire escape. "This is more than just a murder case," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whoever wrote this knew something about the rain, about what it's doing to people." Elliot gave her a skeptical look. "You really think the rain is involved?" "It's just weather, Mason. Weird, sure, but not supernatural." "Then how do you explain this?" Clara shot back, holding up the journal. "The patterns, the whispers, the disappearances, they all tie back to the rain." Elliot rubbed his temples, clearly torn between his instincts as a detective and the mounting evidence in front of him. "All right," he said finally. "Let's say you're right. What do we do about it?" Clara spent the next few days diving deeper into the journal's contents. The entries painted a grim picture of a city haunted by something far older and darker than she had imagined. The author, whose name was never mentioned, described the rain as a living entity, a force that fed on the city's despair, growing stronger with every life it claimed. They called it the Whispering Rain. One passage stood out to Clara. "The rain chooses its victims. It sees them, marks them, takes them. There is no escape." The weight of those words pressed heavily on her as she walked through the city streets that evening. The rain had picked up again, falling in thick sheets that blurred the neon lights into a kaleidoscope of color. Clara's steps slowed as she passed a row of missing persons posters plastered to a brick wall. The faces stared back at her, their eyes filled with hope or fear or resignation. And then she saw him. One of the posters depicted a man in a wide-brimmed hat and dark coat. The photo was grainy, but the resemblance to the figure she'd seen was unmistakable. The name beneath the photo read, James Hollis. Missing since 1989. Clara's heart raced. How could he still be here, more than 30 years later? She snapped a photo of the poster with her phone and hurried back to her apartment. That night, Clara spread out her notes on the kitchen table, trying to make sense of everything. The journal, the missing persons reports, the rain, they were all connected, but the pieces didn't fit together yet. She pulled up James Hollis's name in the public records database. He had been a private investigator, much like herself, working a string of high-profile cases before his sudden disappearance. According to the reports, he had been investigating a series of murders tied to the rain. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're getting too close. Stop before it's too late." Clara's hands trembled as she read the message. She typed a quick reply. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response came almost immediately. "Look outside." Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned toward the window. The man in the hat stood across the street, his figure illuminated by the glow of a flickering street lamp. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her. Clara grabbed her phone and snapped a photo, but when she looked back, he was gone. She collapsed onto the couch, her heart pounding. The rain lashed against the windows, its rhythm no longer random. It was deliberate, like a heartbeat. And somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a whisper. The storm raged with a ferocity Clara had never seen before, transforming the city into a drowned labyrinth of shimmering neon and endless puddles. Thunder rolled overhead, loud enough to rattle the windows of her apartment. The rain was no longer just weather, it was a presence, a force, and Clara felt its weight pressing down on her chest. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her trance. It was Elliot. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "What now?" Clara asked, rubbing her temples. "The lockbox, it's gone." "What?" Clara sat upright, the journal she had been reading falling to the floor. Elliot's voice was taut with frustration. Someone broke into the evidence room. The box, the papers, everything's gone. Clara's mind raced. Do you think it's connected to the man I saw? The one in the hat? Elliot hesitated. I don't know. But I think we're in over our heads, Mason. This isn't just a case anymore. It's something else. They met an hour later at Elliot's precinct, now almost empty in the late-night hours. The storm had kept most of the city indoors, and even the usual hum of police activity was subdued. Elliot ushered her into a side office and closed the door behind them. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. I've been digging into this thing, he said, tossing a file onto the desk. The lockbox, the journal, the rain, it's all tied to a series of cases from the 1980s. Murders, disappearances, strange reports. Hollis was investigating it when he vanished. Clara opened the file and scanned the contents. Grainy photos of crime scenes, snippets of old newspaper articles, and sketches that mirrored the journal's drawings of the gaunt, eyeless figure. According to this, Elliot continued, Hollis thought the rain wasn't natural. He believed it was something alive, something ancient. A predator hunting the people of this city. Clara shivered. And now it's hunting us. Elliot leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. We need to find out who, or what, is behind this. Before it finds us. Their first stop was the abandoned warehouse where Elliot had originally found the lockbox. The dockside district was even more foreboding in the storm, the rain pounding against the rusted metal walls of the old buildings. Elliot led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Clara followed close behind, clutching her own flashlight and trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that had settled over her. This is where we found it, Elliot said, stopping in front of a broken storage locker. The door hung ajar, the interior empty save for a few scattered papers. Clara picked one up. It was a fragment of a police report, the ink smeared by time and water. The words, "Unexplained phenomena," and "missing officer" stood out. As she examined it, a sound echoed through the warehouse, soft and distant, like someone whispering her name. Clara froze. Did you hear that? Elliot nodded, his hand instinctively going to the holster on his hip. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the whispers growing louder with every step. Clara's flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. And then she saw it. The man in the hat stood at the far end of the room, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It's him, Clara whispered. Elliot raised his gun. Don't move! The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Clara's breath caught as she saw the rain swirling around him, defying gravity, as if drawn to him like a living thing. Stop! Elliot barked, his voice firm. The man tilted his head, his face still obscured by the brim of his hat. Then, without warning, he vanished. Clara gasped. Where did he go? Elliot scanned the room, his gun raised. Stay close. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding them. The rain began to seep through the walls, pooling on the floor and crawling toward their feet. This isn't possible, Elliot muttered, his voice tinged with fear. Clara grabbed his arm. We need to get out of here. Before he could respond, the rain surged upward, forming a towering shape in the center of the room. It was humanoid, but its features were indistinct, shifting and melting like liquid. Its eyeless face turned toward them, and Clara felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure lunged. Elliot fired, the gunshots echoing in the cavernous space. The bullets passed through the creature, splashing harmlessly into the walls. Run! Elliot shouted, grabbing Clara's hand. They sprinted toward the exit, the rain-formed entity pursuing them. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful, as it closed the distance. Clara's lungs burned as they burst out into the storm, the cold rain soaking them to the bone. The creature stopped at the threshold of the warehouse, its form dissolving into the downpour. Elliot leaned against a lamppost, catching his breath. What the hell was that? Clara shook her head, her mind racing. I don't know. But it's not going to stop. Back at her apartment, Clara tried to make sense of what had happened. She replayed the events in her mind, searching for clues. Elliot sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He looked shaken, his usual composure cracked. That thing, it wasn't human, he said finally. It wasn't even alive, not in the way we understand. Clara nodded. It's connected to the rain. It has to be. Maybe it is the rain, or something controlling it. Elliot frowned. But why? Why now? The rain's been here for years. Why would it start attacking people? Clara thought of Mick, of his cryptic warnings and his gruesome death. Maybe it's always been doing this. We just weren't paying attention. She picked up the journal, flipping to one of the later entries. The author had described encountering the same rain-formed entity, referring to it as the echo. The echo is not a being. It is a memory, a reflection of the city's despair. It thrives on fear, on pain, on loss. It cannot be fought, only understood. Clara set the journal down, her mind spinning. It's feeding on us. The rain, the disappearances, the murders, they're all part of the same thing. And now it knows we're looking for it. Elliot leaned forward, his expression grim. If we can't fight it, how do we stop it? I don't know, Clara admitted. But we need to find out. Fast. As the rain hammered against the windows, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The echo wasn't just a predator. The rain had become a constant companion, drumming against Clara's apartment windows as though it sought to remind her it was always there. Every sound seemed sharper now, every shadow longer. Sleep, when it came, was a fragile thing, shattered by the faintest noise. By the time dawn arrived, Clara felt like she was drowning, not in water, but in the weight of the secrets she had unearthed. Elliot arrived at her door early that morning, his face pale and drawn. I did some digging, he said as he stepped inside, shaking the rain off his coat. There's more about this. Whispering rain. Clara poured him a cup of coffee and gestured for him to sit. What did you find? Elliot opened a damp folder, laying out documents on her kitchen table. Old urban legends mostly. Stories about the rain as far back as the 1800s. People going missing during storms, strange figures seen in the shadows. The same whispers you've been hearing. Clara picked up one of the papers. It was an article from 1892, its headline reading, Vanishing Amidst the Deluge, a City Haunted by Rain. The accompanying illustration depicted a tall, gaunt figure shrouded in mist, eerily similar to the sketches in the lockbox journal. It's not just the rain, Clara said, her voice quiet. It's something inside it. Watching, waiting. Elliot leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. If these stories are true, it's been here for over a century. Why hasn't anyone stopped it? Maybe no one could, Clara replied. Or maybe they didn't survive long enough to try. That afternoon, Clara and Elliot ventured into the city's archives, hoping to uncover more about the rain's dark history. The old library was cavernous and eerily quiet, the storm outside muffled by thick stone walls. They split up, each taking a stack of dusty records and microfilm reels. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft rustle of paper and the occasional murmur of frustration. It was Clara who found it. Elliot, she called, her voice trembling. He joined her at the table, peering over her shoulder. She had uncovered an old police report from 1927, detailing a series of disappearances during a particularly harsh storm season. The report described eyewitness accounts of a figure appearing in the rain, its presence heralded by whispers. One detail stood out. The witnesses claimed the figure wasn't just taking people, it was consuming them. The rain swallows them. Elliot read aloud, his brow furrowing. What does that even mean? Clara shook her head. Whatever it means, it's not good. She flipped to the last page of the report, where the lead investigator had scrawled a chilling note. We are not meant to understand this. The rain is alive, and it hungers. May God help us all. As night fell, Clara and Elliot returned to her apartment, their nerves frayed. The storm had intensified, the rain pounding against the city with relentless fury. Clara sat on her couch, staring at the journal. The phrase, "The rain hungers," echoed in her mind, filling her with a cold dread. Do you think it's targeting us? She asked, breaking the silence. Elliot shrugged, his expression grim. It feels like it. The way it appeared at the warehouse, it wasn't random. Clara nodded. It's not just feeding, it's choosing. Before Elliot could respond, a strange noise interrupted them. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, filling the room with an eerie cadence. A whisper. Clara's breath caught. She turned toward the window, where the rain streaked the glass in chaotic patterns. For a moment, she thought she saw something moving in the downpour, a shape, indistinct but undeniably there. Do you see that? She whispered. Elliot joined her at the window, squinting into the storm. I don't see. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. Clara screamed as a torrent of water surged into the room, knocking her off her feet. Elliot shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the rain. The water coalesced in the center of the room, rising and twisting into a humanoid form. Its eyeless face turned toward Clara, and she felt an overwhelming wave of despair wash over her. Run! Elliot yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. They stumbled into a hallway, the rain-formed entity close behind. Its movements were unnatural, almost hypnotic, as it pursued them with unrelenting purpose. Clara and Elliot burst out onto the fire escape, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Below, the streets were eerily empty, the rain masking any sound of life. It's still coming, Clara said, her voice shaking. Elliot pulled her toward the stairs. We need to get out of here. Now. They descended into the alley, their footsteps splashing through puddles. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more insistent. Clara glanced over her shoulder and froze. The figure stood at the edge of the fire escape, its body dissolving and reforming with the rain. It's playing with us, she muttered. Elliot grabbed her hand. Keep moving! They ran for blocks, the rain never letting up. The city felt different now, darker, emptier, as if the rain had washed away all traces of humanity. Finally, they ducked into an abandoned subway station, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The air inside was damp and cold, the faint smell of mildew mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Clara sank onto a bench, her hands trembling. What was that thing? The echo? Elliot shook his head. I don't think so. It felt worse. Like it was more than just the rain. Like it was the thing controlling it. Clara closed her eyes. The image of the entity burned into her mind. The journal called it the Whisperer. Elliot looked at her sharply. What does it want? Clara opened her eyes, her expression grim. It wants us. It wants everyone. They stayed in the subway station until the first light of dawn, the storm finally beginning to abate. The whisperer hadn't followed them, but its presence lingered in Clara's mind, a shadow that refused to be shaken. As they emerged onto the streets, the city felt eerily quiet. The rain had left everything slick and shining, the neon signs reflecting off the wet pavement. "We can't keep running," Clara said, her voice firm. "We need to find a way to fight back." Elliot nodded, his jaw set. "Agreed. But how do you fight something like that?" Clara didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the whisperer was still out there, waiting. And it was hungry. The morning sun pierced through the cloud cover, painting the city in muted gray light. For the first time in days, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. Clara stood at her window, staring at the droplets sliding down the glass. They looked harmless now, ordinary. Yet she knew better. The whisperer's encounter had left her shaken to her core. Its presence, the way it moved, how it manipulated the rain, it wasn't just a predator. It was an entity with intent, with purpose. Elliot had stayed the night, sleeping fitfully on her couch. He stirred awake as Clara set 2 cups of coffee on the table. "Thanks," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Elliot shook his head. "Not great. I keep hearing those whispers in my head. Even in my dreams." "Me too," Clara admitted. "But it's not just whispers anymore. It's like the rain itself is watching us." Later that morning, they returned to the precinct, determined to find answers. Clara wasn't sure what they were looking for, but she knew they couldn't stop digging. The city's silence felt unnatural, the usual hum of life replaced by an oppressive stillness. At Elliot's desk, Clara pulled out the journal again, flipping through the pages with purpose. She paused at an entry near the end, the handwriting frantic and uneven. "The rain is not water. It carries something else, something alive. It infects, it corrodes, it consumes. Beware its touch, for it is no longer just a storm, it is hunger." She read the passage aloud, her voice tinged with dread. Elliot frowned. "It infects? What does that mean?" "I don't know," Clara said. "But if Hollis was right, the rain is more than a medium for the whisperer. It's part of it. Or maybe it is the whisperer." Elliot leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "If that's true, then every drop of rain in this city is a weapon." Their next stop was the city's water treatment facility. If the rain carried something malevolent, it might have left traces in the water supply. Clara contacted an old college friend, Dr. Lena Walsh, who worked as a microbiologist at the facility. Lena greeted them at the gate, her face creased with concern. "Clara, you sounded panicked on the phone. What's going on?" Clara hesitated. How could she explain the inexplicable? "We think there's something in the rain. Something dangerous. We need your help to analyze it." Lena raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Come on. Let's take a look." Inside the lab, Lena collected a sample from the rain pooling outside and placed it under a microscope. As she worked, Clara and Elliot watched in tense silence. Finally, Lena straightened, her expression unreadable. "There's definitely something unusual here." "What do you mean?" Elliot asked. Lena turned the microscope toward them. "Take a look." Clara peered through the lens, her breath catching. The water wasn't just water. Tiny, thread-like organisms swam within it, their movements erratic and unsettling. They glowed faintly, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed almost intentional. "What are those?" Clara asked, stepping back. "I have no idea," Lena admitted. "They're not like any microorganisms I've ever seen. They're too complex. Too coordinated." Elliot frowned. "Could they be dangerous?" Lena hesitated. Possibly. If these things get into the human body, who knows what they could do? Clara's mind raced. It's not just the whisperer. The rain itself is alive. It's part of this infection. Lena looked between them, her concern deepening. What exactly are you dealing with here? Elliot exchanged a glance with Clara before responding. Something we don't fully understand. But it's killing people. As they left the facility, the rain began to pick up again, each drop feeling heavier than before. Clara couldn't shake the image of the glowing organisms swimming in the water. What if it's spreading? She asked. It probably is, Elliot said grimly. If those things are in the rain, then everyone in this city has been exposed. The implications were horrifying. The rain wasn't just a storm, it was a weapon, and the Whisperer was wielding it with precision. That evening, they decided to visit one of the city's oldest neighborhoods, where several recent disappearances had been reported. The streets were narrow and poorly lit, the rain pooling in deep, murky puddles. This place feels wrong, Clara said, shivering despite her heavy coat. Elliot nodded, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Stay close. They moved cautiously, the whispers beginning to rise around them. Clara's heart pounded as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the whisperer lurking in the shadows. They stopped in front of an old, boarded-up house, its windows shattered and its paint peeling. According to police records, this was where the last victim had been seen. Elliot pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air inside was damp and cold, the faint smell of mildew mingling with something more acrid. Do you hear that? Clara whispered. Elliot paused, his flashlight steady. Yeah. It's coming from upstairs. They climbed the creaking staircase, each step feeling like a leap into the unknown. At the top, they found a door slightly ajar, the whispers growing louder. Elliot pushed the door open, revealing a room that looked untouched for decades. Dust covered every surface, and the rain seeped through cracks in the ceiling, forming puddles on the floor. In the center of the room stood a chair, and on it sat a figure, a man, his head bowed, his body unnaturally still. Sir? Elliot said cautiously, stepping closer. The man didn't respond. As Elliot approached, Clara noticed something strange. The puddles on the floor were moving, converging toward the man's feet. Elliot, don't, she began, but it was too late. The man's head snapped up, revealing hollow, eyeless sockets. His skin was pale and slick, as if it had been soaked for days. He opened his mouth, and a stream of water poured out, pooling at his feet. Elliot stumbled back, drawing his gun. The man stood, his movements jerky and unnatural. The puddles rose around him, forming tendrils that reached out toward them. Run! Clara shouted, grabbing Elliot's arm. They fled down the stairs, the rain inside the house surging after them like a living thing. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling Clara's ears with words she couldn't understand but felt in her bones. Outside, the storm had grown fiercer, the rain lashing at them with a fury that felt personal. Clara and Elliot ran until their lungs burned, finally ducking into a nearby alley. What the hell was that? Elliot gasped, clutching his side. Clara leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. It's spreading. The rain is turning people into that. Elliot's expression was grim. If we don't stop this, the whole city is doomed. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we stop it. Whatever it takes. As the rain poured down around them, Clara knew they were running out of time. The Whisperer's hunger was growing, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything. The rain had become relentless again, drumming against the city like a steady heartbeat. Clara sat at her desk, staring at the glowing organisms under a portable microscope borrowed from Lena. Their movements felt deliberate, coordinated, like they were watching her. Elliot was pacing. This thing isn't just supernatural. It's manipulating people. That man in the house, he wasn't human anymore. Clara leaned back, her mind reeling. And what if he's not alone? If the rain is infecting others, there could be more like him. The entire city might already be under its control. Elliot stopped. What about those disappearances? Maybe some of them didn't vanish. Maybe they're like him now. His words sent a chill through her. The thought of an entire city turning into vessels for the Whisperer was too horrifying to comprehend. That was when Clara remembered something from the journal. Flipping back through its pages, she found the passage. There are those who welcome the rain, who bow before it. They are not victims but worshippers. They feed it, nurture it, offer it gifts. Clara looked up at Elliot, her voice trembling. What if some people aren't resisting this thing? What if they're helping it? The idea was absurd, but as they dug deeper into police reports and old urban legends, patterns began to emerge. In neighborhoods where the rain was heaviest, there were whispers of strange gatherings, people disappearing only to be seen later, their eyes blank, their movements mechanical. There's a cult, Clara said, the words almost choking her. A group that worships the Whisperer, feeding its sacrifices. It's the only explanation for why some of these areas are so heavily targeted. Elliot frowned. How do we find them? These people aren't going to advertise their meetings. Clara thought for a moment, then pulled out her laptop. She scrolled through forums and message boards, searching for keywords related to the rain and disappearances. After an hour, she found a thread titled, "The Rain Knows Your Name." The post was cryptic, but it referenced an abandoned church on the outskirts of the city, a place where the rain sings its loudest. This is it, Clara said, showing the screen to Elliot. Elliot sighed. An old church in a storm. Great. This just keeps getting better. That night they drove out to the church, its towering spire visible even through the downpour. The building was a shadowy silhouette against the sky, its windows shattered and its doors hanging ajar. This place looks like it's been abandoned for decades, Elliot said, stepping out of the car and pulling his hood up against the rain. Clara followed, gripping a flashlight tightly. That's probably why they're using it. No one comes out here. As they approached the entrance, the whispers began again. They were faint at first, carried on the wind, but they grew louder with each step. Inside, the church was a husk of its former self. The pews were rotting, the altar covered in moss and grime. Yet there was a strange energy in the air, something that made Clara's skin crawl. Elliot pointed to the floor near the altar. Look at that! A large, circular symbol was etched into the wooden planks, its lines glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Around it were various objects, candles, bones, and jars filled with dark, viscous liquid. It's a ritual site, Clara said, her voice hushed. Before they could examine it further, they heard footsteps. Elliot pulled his gun, motioning for Clara to stay behind him. The footsteps grew louder, and then a group of figures emerged from the shadows. There were 5 of them, all wearing dark, rain-soaked robes. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were part of some strange dance. One of them stepped forward, pulling back their hood. It was an older woman, her face pale and gaunt. Her eyes glistened with an eerie light, as if the rain itself was inside her. "You should not be here," she said, her voice a low rasp. Clara stepped forward, ignoring Elliot's protests. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The woman smiled, revealing teeth that looked sharper than they should. "We are servants of the rain. We honor it, feed it, sustain it. You're helping it kill people," Clara said, her voice rising. The woman tilted her head. It is not killing. It is consuming. The rain must grow, and we are its hands. Without us, it would wither and die. Elliot tightened his grip on his gun. Where's the whisperer? Is it here? The woman's smile widened. The whisperer is everywhere. It is the rain, and the rain is it. Clara's stomach turned. The cult wasn't just worshipping the whisperer, they were part of it, extensions of its will. You won't stop us, the woman said, her tone calm but firm. The rain cannot be stopped. It is eternal. Elliot raised his gun. We'll see about that. Before he could act, the cultists began to chant. Their voices rose in unison, the glowing symbol on the floor pulsing with light. The air grew heavier, the rain outside intensifying. Elliot, we need to go! Clara shouted, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The puddles on the floor began to rise, forming tendrils that reached for them. Elliot fired his gun, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck one of the cultists, but they didn't fall. Instead, they dissolved into water, their form melting and rejoining the puddles. Run! Clara screamed, pulling Elliot toward the exit. They sprinted out of the church, the rain seeming to claw at them with every step. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that followed them into the night. Back in the car, Clara gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. That wasn't just a cult. They're part of the rain, Elliot. They're connected to it. Elliot stared out the window, his face pale. How do you fight something like that? You can't kill water. Clara didn't answer. Her mind was racing, piecing together everything they had learned. The rain wasn't just a force of nature, it was a living, sentient entity with worshippers who fed its hunger. But there had to be a way to stop it. There had to be. We need to figure out what it wants, she said finally. If we can understand its purpose, maybe we can find a way to weaken it. Elliot nodded slowly. Agreed. But if those people are any indication, we're running out of time. As the rain continued to pour, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the whisperer was watching them, waiting. The cult had revealed its hand, but it was only a matter of time before the rain made its next move. And when it did, Clara knew it wouldn't be merciful. The city had never felt so lifeless. The rain was heavier than ever, drowning the streets under inches of water. The storm seemed alive, pulsing with a rhythm Clara could feel in her chest. Buildings stood like silent sentinels, their windows reflecting the oppressive gloom. People moved like shadows, their faces hidden beneath umbrellas and soaked hoods. Clara and Elliot drove through the city in silence, the sound of rain pounding on the windshield filling the car. The storm wasn't just weather anymore, it was a predator, stalking the city, claiming more victims by the hour. The precinct's been flooded with missing persons reports, Elliot said, breaking the silence. Entire families disappearing overnight. No signs of struggle, no bodies. Just gone. Clara nodded grimly. It's getting worse. The rain's spreading faster, taking more people. And those cultists, whatever they're doing, it's helping the whisperer. Elliot's grip tightened on the steering wheel. We need to stop this. But I don't even know where to start. They arrived at the precinct to find it in chaos. Officers were shouting over each other, phones ringing incessantly. Clara's captain, a grizzled veteran named Hartman, met them at the door, his face etched with worry. Clara, Elliot. Good you're here, he said, gesturing for them to follow him. He led them to a briefing room, where a map of the city was spread out on the table. Red pins marked areas with the highest concentration of disappearances. It's spreading outward, Hartman said, pointing to the pins. The disappearances started in the central districts, but now they're hitting the outskirts. We're losing people faster than we can count. Clara leaned over the map, her stomach churning. The pattern was clear, the rain wasn't random. It was expanding, consuming the city one neighborhood at a time. What about survivors? Elliot asked. Anyone seen after they vanish? Hartman shook his head. Not a single one. It's like they're being erased. As they left the precinct, Clara's phone buzzed. It was Lena. Clara, you need to get back to the lab. I found something, Lena said, her voice urgent. What is it? I ran more tests on the rain samples. It's worse than we thought. Just get here. They drove through the flooded streets to the water treatment facility. Lena met them at the entrance, her face pale. She led them to her lab, where a monitor displayed a series of graphs and images. The organisms in the rain, Lena began. They're not just alive, they're evolving. Rapidly. They're forming complex structures, almost like neural networks. It's like the rain is thinking. Clara felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Thinking? You mean it's intelligent? Lena nodded. Yes. And it's getting smarter. The more it spreads, the stronger it becomes. I think the rain is learning how to take over completely. Elliot cursed under his breath. How do we stop it? I don't know, Lena admitted. But there's one more thing. The organisms are emitting a frequency, low, almost imperceptible. But when I amplified it, she pressed a button, and a recording played. It was the whisper. The same eerie, layered murmur Clara had heard so many times. Hearing it again sent shivers down her spine. The rain's communication, Lena said. It's broadcasting this signal, calling out to something. Or someone. Clara exchanged a glance with Elliot. The whisper wasn't just a manifestation of the rain. It was the rain's mind, its voice. And it was calling for more. As they left the lab, Clara's thoughts raced. The city was already on the brink of collapse. If the rain's spread wasn't stopped, it would consume everything. What do we do now? Elliot asked as they drove back into the heart of the city. We find the source, Clara said firmly. Every storm has an origin point. If we can find where the whisperer first manifested, maybe we can figure out how to stop it. Elliot nodded. Then we need to talk to the cultists. They seem to know more about this thing than anyone else. They returned to the abandoned church, the rain hammering against its decrepit walls. The whispers greeted them as they stepped inside, louder and more insistent than before. The ritual circle was still there, its glow pulsing in time with the rain. Clara and Elliot searched the building but found no sign of the cultists. They must have moved, Elliot said. Clara's eyes fell on the ritual circle. Maybe they left us a clue. She crouched beside it, studying the symbols. They were intricate, overlapping in ways that seemed to defy logic. At the center was an engraving of an eye, surrounded by lines that radiated outward like rays of light. It's a map, she realized, tracing the lines with her finger. These symbols correspond to streets in the city. Elliot leaned over her shoulder. That's the industrial district. The old warehouses. That must be where they've gone, Clara said, standing. If the cult is still performing rituals, we'll find them there. The industrial district was a labyrinth of crumbling factories and rusting machinery. The rain pooled in the alleyways, forming streams that seemed to pull them deeper into the maze. This place is a nightmare, Elliot muttered, his hand resting on his gun. Clara stopped in front of a large warehouse, its windows glowing faintly from within. The whispers were louder here, vibrating in her skull. This is it, she said. They approached cautiously, peering through a crack in the door. Inside, dozens of cultists were gathered, their robes soaked, their heads bowed. At the center of the room was a massive basin filled with rainwater, its surface rippling unnaturally. A figure stood at the basin's edge, their hands raised. It was the woman from the church, her voice rising in a chant that seemed to reverberate through the air. Clara and Elliot slipped inside, hiding behind a stack of crates. "What are they doing?" Elliot whispered. Clara watched as the woman dipped her hands into the basin, pulling out a shimmering, undulating form, a shape that defied description. The cultists knelt, their voices joining hers in a chorus that made Clara's skin crawl. "They're summoning something," she said. Elliot clenched his jaw. "We can't let them finish." He pulled out his gun, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Wait. We need to know what they're doing first. If we act now, we might miss our chance to stop it for good." Reluctantly, Elliot lowered his weapon. As the ritual reached its climax, the shimmering form in the basin began to rise. It twisted and expanded, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. The whispers grew deafening, filling the warehouse with a sound that was both alien and agonizingly familiar. Clara's heart pounded as she realized what she was seeing. The whisperer wasn't just a part of the rain, it was the rain's made flesh. The woman turned, her glowing eyes scanning the room. "The time has come," she intoned. "The city will be reborn. The rain will cleanse it, and we shall be its vessels." Clara couldn't wait any longer. She motioned to Elliot, and they stepped out from behind the crates, guns drawn. "Stop the ritual!" Clara shouted. The cultists turned, their faces blank, their eyes devoid of humanity. The woman sneered. "You cannot stop the inevitable." Elliot fired a warning shot into the air. "Try us." But the cultists didn't flinch. Instead, the rain began to pour inside the warehouse, the puddles on the floor rising to form tendrils that reached toward them. "Clara, we need to move!" Elliot yelled, pulling her back. The whisperer's form turned toward them, its featureless face tilting as if in recognition. Clara's blood ran cold. It wasn't just looking at her, it was seeing her, knowing her. The rain surged forward, and Clara and Elliot ran, the whispers chasing them into the storm. The rain fell harder than Clara had ever seen, cascading in sheets so thick the city became a blur. The downpour was deafening, drowning out every sound except the whispers that had become a constant presence. Clara and Elliot stood in Lena's lab, staring at a map of the city. Lena had traced the patterns of the rain's spread, pinpointing a single location, a reservoir at the city's edge. "This is the epicenter," Lena said, her voice trembling. "The rain's heaviest here. Whatever's controlling it is there." Clara's hand tightened into a fist. The whisperer. "If we end it, maybe this nightmare stops." Lena looked hesitant. "I don't know if it can be destroyed. The rain isn't just water anymore, it's alive, and it's everywhere." Elliot checked his gun, his jaws set. "Then we end this thing at the source, or we die trying." The journey to the reservoir felt surreal. The streets were deserted, the storm swallowing the city whole. Buildings loomed like ghostly monoliths, their windows streaked with rain. As they approached the reservoir, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices echoing in Clara's mind. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the rain itself was watching them. The reservoir's gates stood open, the structure beyond shrouded in mist. Water spilled over the edges, cascading into a swirling vortex that seemed to pulse with an unnatural glow. "This is it," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Elliot nodded. "Let's finish this." Inside the reservoir, the whispers became deafening. The chamber was massive, its walls slick with water. In the center stood a towering figure, its form shifting and amorphous, made entirely of the rain. It was the whisperer. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its very being radiating power. Its face, or what passed for one, turned toward her, featureless yet piercing in its gaze. "You have come," it said, its voice a layered murmur that resonated in Clara's skull. "You seek to end what cannot be ended." Elliot raised his gun. "We'll see about that." He fired, but the bullets passed through the whisper, dissolving into droplets that rejoined its body. The creature laughed, a sound that sent chills down Clara's spine. "You cannot harm me," it said. "I am the rain. I am eternal." Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Then why do you need the cult? Why the rituals? If you're so powerful, why do you need them to spread?" The whisperer tilted its head. "The rain is strong, but it requires vessels. Willing hands to shape its path. The cult understands this. They embrace the cleansing." Clara's mind raced. The whisperer wasn't invincible. It relied on the cult to amplify its power. Without them, it might be vulnerable. "Elliot, we need to disrupt its connection to the cult," she shouted. Elliot nodded, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted a series of symbols carved into the walls, glowing faintly. "Those symbols, they are like the ones in the church," he said. Lena's voice echoed in Clara's memory. "The rain is broadcasting a frequency." "Destroy them!" Clara yelled. Elliot grabbed a piece of metal pipe and began smashing the symbols. Each time one was destroyed, the whisperer recoiled, its form flickering like a weak signal. "No!" it roared, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "You will not defy me!" The rain surged, forming tendrils that lashed out at them. Clara dodged, grabbing a crowbar and helping Elliot. Together, they shattered the last of the symbols. The whisperer let out an unearthly scream, its form collapsing in on itself. The rain began to waver, its intensity lessening. But it wasn't over. "You have weakened me," the whisperer hissed, its voice quieter now. "But I will not be undone. Not by you." The room began to shake, water pouring in from every direction. The whisperer was trying to drown them. "Clara, we need to move!" Elliot shouted. Clara hesitated, staring at the collapsing form of the whisperer. Then she turned and ran. They barely made it out of the reservoir before the entire structure collapsed, water spilling out into the surrounding streets. The rain had stopped, leaving the city eerily quiet. Clara and Elliot sat on the curb, drenched and exhausted. For the first time in days, the sky was clear, revealing a pale moon and a scattering of stars. "We did it," Elliot said, his voice hoarse. Clara nodded, though her chest felt heavy. The whisper was gone, but at what cost? As the city began to stir, survivors emerged from their homes, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, and the sound of helicopters grew louder. Lena arrived a short time later, her car skidding to a stop. She jumped out, relief flooding her face when she saw them. "You're alive," she said, running over. "The rain, it's gone." "For now," Clara said. "But it's not over." Lena frowned. "What do you mean?" Clara looked at the horizon, where storm clouds were beginning to gather again. "The whisperer's form is gone, but its essence, it's still out there. The rain isn't just water. It's alive, and it's waiting." In the days that followed, the city began to rebuild. The authorities dismissed the events as a freak storm, though whispers of what truly happened spread among the survivors. Clara and Elliot tried to return to their lives, but the scars ran deep. The rain had taken too much, friends, colleagues, and a sense of safety that would never fully return. One evening, Clara stood on her apartment balcony, staring at the city below. The air was crisp, the streets dry. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the rain was watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Elliot joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. You okay? She nodded, though her hands trembled. Do you think we really stopped it? Elliot was silent for a moment. I think we bought some time. But if it comes back, we'll be ready. Clara forced a smile, though her heart ached with uncertainty. The rain might return, and when it did, she knew the fight would be even harder. But for now, the city was silent. And for Clara, that silence was enough.